1954. Two men who never worked together, barely knew each other, and died decades apart became locked in Hollywood's most enduring rivalry. Marlon Brando and James Dean were forever compared, forever contrasted, forever positioned as opposing forces in the battle for the soul of American acting. Critics called Dean Brando's copy. Dean called Brando his inspiration. And Brando? He rarely mentioned Dean at all, which somehow made the rivalry even more intense. But here's the truth nobody tells. The Brando versus Dean rivalry was mostly invented by critics, studios, and audiences who needed to understand two revolutionary actors by pitting them against each other. The real story is stranger and sadder. It's about a young man desperately trying to escape the shadow of his idol, and an older actor who watched his own revolution get credited to someone else. This is the story of how Hollywood created its greatest rivalry. How Elia Kazan almost cast Brando as Cal Trask before choosing Dean. How one sentence from a critic, plagiaristic resemblance, defined Dean's entire career. How two broken men used the same technique to channel their pain, but in completely different ways. And how Dean's death at 24 guaranteed he'd forever be compared to a man he idolized, feared, and could never truly compete with. Spring 1953. Director Elia Kazan had a problem. He'd just acquired the rights to John Steinbeck's East of Eden, and he needed someone to play Cal Trask, the tortured, emotionally volatile son desperate for his father's love. Kazan had co-founded the Actors Studio, pioneered method acting in America, and worked with the best young actors in the business. His first choice was obvious: Marlon Brando. Brando had already revolutionized American acting with A Streetcar Named Desire in 1951 and On the Waterfront was about to make him the biggest star in Hollywood. At 30 years old, Brando was the undisputed king of method acting. The actor who proved you could mumble, slouch, scratch yourself, and be emotionally raw on screen while still being magnetic and brilliant. Kazan approached Brando about playing Cal. The role seemed perfect. A sensitive young man at war with his rigid father, channeling rage and vulnerability in equal measure. It was Brando territory. The wounded rebel, the misunderstood outsider, the boy who needed love but could only express it through violence and pain. Brando read the script and said no. The reason? He was too old. Cal Trask was supposed to be 17, maybe 18. Brando was 30. Even with Hollywood magic, there was no way to make a 30-year-old man look like a teenager. Brando knew it would be ridiculous. He declined. Kazan then considered Montgomery Clift for Cal's brother Aaron. Clift was 34, even older than Brando. The idea of two men in their 30s playing teenage brothers was absurd. Kazan needed to find younger actors, real young men who could authentically portray adolescent angst. That's when someone mentioned James Dean. James Dean had been obsessed with Marlon Brando since seeing A Streetcar Named Desire on Broadway in 1951. Dean was 20 years old, struggling in New York, taking classes at the Actors Studio, and desperately searching for a model of what a real actor could be. Brando showed him. Here was a man who didn't sound like a classical theater actor, didn't move like a Hollywood star, didn't hide his emotional mess behind technique. Brando was raw, real, dangerous. He made vulnerability look masculine. He made sensitivity look powerful. He proved that being broken could be beautiful on screen. Dean studied Brando obsessively. He watched Streetcar multiple times, memorizing Brando's gestures, his vocal rhythms, his physical presence. He copied Brando's slouch, the way Brando shoved his hands in his pockets, the way Brando turned his collar up against an invisible wind. Dean even tried to dress like Brando. T-shirts, jeans, leather jackets, the working-class uniform that Brando had made cool. At the actor's studio, teachers noticed Dean's Brando obsession. Lee Strasberg warned him, "You can't just copy Marlon. You have to find your own instrument, your own pain." But Dean couldn't help himself. Brando had shown him what was possible. Now Dean needed to figure out how to get there. The problem was that everyone else noticed too. When Dean performed scenes at the studio, other actors would whisper, "He's doing Brando." When he auditioned for roles, directors would say, "Too much like Marlon." Dean was trapped, inspired by Brando, but defined by the comparison, unable to be seen as his own artist. Then Elia Kazan gave him the role Brando had turned down, and the comparison became unavoidable. These forgotten stories deserve to be told. If you think so too, subscribe and like this video. Thank you for keeping these memories alive. Dean's audition for East of Eden was legendary. Kazan asked him to perform a scene where Cal confronts his father. Dean prepared by thinking about his own father's rejection, channeling real pain into the performance. When he read for Kazan, he didn't just act. He exploded. Dean threw himself around the room. He shouted, whispered, broke down crying, punched the wall. His emotions were completely uncontrolled, volcanic, barely contained. It was method acting at its most raw and dangerous. No polish, no technique visible, just pure feeling pouring out. Kazan watched and saw two things simultaneously: incredible talent and obvious Brando influence. The mumbling, the physical intensity, the emotional nakedness. It was all Brando's vocabulary, spoken with Dean's accent. But there was something different too, something Brando never showed. A desperate, almost childlike need for love. Brando's characters were dangerous and sexual. Dean's Cal Trask would be wounded and needy. Kazan cast Dean anyway. He knew the Brando comparisons would come. They were inevitable. But Kazan also sensed that Dean's pain was different from Brando's, more raw and less controlled. Brando was a skilled actor using method technique. Dean was a damaged kid using acting to survive. Paul Newman, who also auditioned for Cal, later admitted, "I was too old, and I didn't have what Jimmy had." That quality of being completely split open, emotionally exposed. He was so vulnerable, it was almost uncomfortable to watch. Dean got the role, and immediately the Brando comparisons began. The critics' attack. Plagiaristic resemblance. When East of Eden premiered on March 9, 1955, critics couldn't review James Dean without mentioning Marlon Brando. Every single major review positioned Dean as either Brando's heir or his imitator. The most damaging assessment came from Truman Capote, writing in The New Yorker in 1957. Many critics reviewing East of Eden remarked on the well-nigh plagiaristic resemblance between Dean's acting mannerisms and Brando's. Plagiaristic. That word attached itself to Dean like a curse. Not influenced by or inspired by, plagiaristic, suggesting Dean was a thief, a copycat, someone who stole Brando's technique and passed it off as his own. Bosley Crowther of the New York Times wrote, "Mr. Dean scuffs his feet, shivers his shoulders, and sounds like Marlon Brando. His performance is a mass of histrionic gingerbread that clearly emulates the style of Mr. Brando." Other critics were kinder, but still made the comparison. Jack Moffat of The Hollywood Reporter wrote, "It is inevitable that he will be compared to Marlon Brando. Though he is no carbon copy of that capable player, even positive reviews couldn't escape the Brando framework." Dean wasn't allowed to be his own artist. He was always like Brando, or influenced by Brando, or the next Brando. The comparison overshadowed everything else about his performance. Dean was devastated. He'd worked so hard to find his own voice, to channel his own pain, to be authentic. And critics reduced him to a Brando impersonator. He gave interviews trying to explain the difference. "I'm not like Brando. We're different people with different backgrounds, different pain." But nobody listened. Hollywood had decided Dean was Brando 2.0, the younger model, the replacement for when Brando got too expensive or difficult. It was reductive, unfair, and impossible to escape. Here's what critics in 1955 couldn't see. Brando and Dean were using similar techniques to express completely different things. Brando's method acting was powerful and controlled. He made careful choices about when to explode and when to contain himself. His characters, Stanley Kowalski, Terry Malloy, Johnny Strabler, were men who used physical power to compensate for emotional inarticulation. They couldn't express their feelings in words, so they expressed them through violence, sexuality, and intimidation. Brando's characters were dangerous. You watched them wondering when they'd snap, when the barely contained rage would explode. But underneath the danger was technique. Brando knew exactly what he was doing. Every mumble, every shoulder shrug, every moment of apparent spontaneity was calculated. Dean's acting was different. Where Brando was controlled volcanic power, Dean was uncontrolled desperation. Dean's characters, Cal Trask, Jim Stark, Jet Rink, weren't dangerous to others. They were dangerous to themselves. They wanted to be loved so badly they'd destroy themselves trying to earn it. Dean's technique was less visible because there was less technique. He really was channeling his actual trauma, his real abandonment, his genuine need. Brando played wounded men. Dean was a wounded man playing himself. The physical similarities, the mumbling, the slouching, the fidgeting, were surface level. Underneath, Brando projected strength barely containing rage. Dean projected fragility barely containing collapse. Brando's characters might hurt you. Dean's characters would definitely hurt themselves. Critics who called Dean a Brando imitator were watching the gestures and missing the soul. So what did Marlon Brando actually think about James Dean? The answer is complicated. Brando rarely spoke about Dean publicly, which drove people crazy. Was it dismissal, jealousy, indifference? The silence became its own statement. When Brando did comment, he was typically cryptic. In one interview, he said, "Dean was a nice kid, talented. He reminded me of myself when I was younger. That hunger to prove something. That's it. No grand statement about Dean's genius. No bitter resentment about being compared to a younger actor. No competitive hostility. Just acknowledgement that Dean was talented and hungry." Later, when someone asked Brando if he minded being compared to Dean, Brando shrugged. "We were different actors. People who compare us don't understand either of us." The truth is, Brando and Dean barely knew each other. They met exactly once, briefly, at a Hollywood party in 1954. Dean approached Brando nervously, starstruck, wanting to tell his idol how much Streetcar had meant to him. Brando was polite but distant, uncomfortable with Dean's intensity. There was no rivalry between them personally because there was barely a relationship. The rivalry existed entirely in critics' reviews, studio marketing, and audience imagination. But Dean desperately wanted Brando's approval. He wanted his idol to see him as an equal, not an imitator. He wanted Brando to understand that Dean wasn't copying him. He was trying to survive using the same tools Brando had pioneered. Dean never got that acknowledgement. Brando remained distant, neither embracing Dean as a fellow artist nor rejecting him as a plagiarist. The indifference was somehow worse than hostility would have been. Warner Brothers loved the Brando comparisons. Their marketing department actively encouraged them. If James Dean was the next Marlon Brando, that meant he was marketable, valuable, someone who could carry films the way Brando did. Studio executives told Dean to lean into the Brando comparison for publicity. They arranged photo shoots where Dean posed like Brando, in t-shirts and jeans, with cigarettes dangling from his lips, projecting brooding intensity. They fed stories to gossip columnists about Dean studying Brando, learning from Brando, challenging Brando. It was all invented, but it sold movie tickets. When Rebel Without a Cause went into production in 1955, Warner Brothers marketed it as Brando meets teenage angst. Director Nicholas Ray fought against this framing, insisting Dean was his own artist with his own style. The studio ignored him. By the time Giant was released in 1956, after Dean's death, Warner Brothers had fully committed to the Brando narrative. Promotional materials described Dean as the actor who would have surpassed Brando, and Brando's only true rival. It was ghoulish and calculated, using Dean's death to create a mythological rivalry that never actually existed. The irony was that Brando's career and Dean's career barely overlapped. By the time Dean became famous, Brando was already established. There was no competition for the same roles, no auction between studios choosing one over the other, no head-to-head rivalry. But Hollywood needed the story. Two rebels, two method actors, two wounded men. It was too perfect not to manufacture into a rivalry. At the Actors Studio, teachers tried to explain the difference between Brando's method and Dean's method to students who wanted to emulate both. Lee Strasberg, the studio's guru, described it this way. Marlon controls his instrument. Jimmy is his instrument. Marlon knows when to turn the emotion on and off. Jimmy doesn't turn it off. He lives in it. This was crucial. Method acting, as Strasberg taught it, was about using personal experiences and sense memory to access authentic emotions. But there was supposed to be control, boundaries, the ability to separate yourself from the character when the camera stopped rolling. Brando mastered this. He could access deep emotions for a scene, then turn them off when Kazan yelled, "Cut." He could go home, have dinner, live his life, and return the next day to access those emotions again. The pain informed his performance, but didn't consume his life. Dean couldn't do this. When he accessed his trauma for a scene, it overwhelmed him. He couldn't turn it off. The emotions bled into his real life. He'd stay in character for days, brooding like Cal Trask or raging like Jim Stark, unable to separate performance from reality. If you want more untold stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and leave a like. Your support means everything to us. This made Dean incredibly powerful on camera. You were watching someone genuinely suffering, not an actor pretending to suffer. But it also made Dean psychologically vulnerable. He was destroying himself for his art in ways that worried everyone around him. Paula Strasberg, Lee's wife and Dean's mentor, put it bluntly. Marlon uses the method. The method uses Jimmy. There was actually a third actor in this rivalry that people often forget. Montgomery Clift. Clift pioneered vulnerable masculinity in Hollywood before either Brando or Dean. His performances in Red River, 1948, A Place in the Sun, 1951, and From Here to Eternity, 1953, showed that male actors could be emotionally fragile, psychologically complex, and sexually ambiguous while still being leading men. Clift was the template that both Brando and Dean built on. He proved sensitive men could be stars. He showed that technique and emotion could coexist. He demonstrated that audiences would embrace damaged masculinity if it was performed with enough authenticity. Brando took Clift's sensitivity and added danger. Dean took Clift's fragility and added desperation. All three were method actors. All three played wounded men. All three revolutionized masculine performance. But Clift was older, less commercially successful, and after his devastating 1956 car accident, less physically beautiful. Hollywood preferred the Brando versus Dean narrative. Two young, gorgeous rebels fighting for supremacy. Clift became the forgotten influence, the actor who made both of them possible, but got written out of the story. Dean actually acknowledged Clift's influence more than Brando's in private. He told friends that Clift showed him you could be broken and still be beautiful. But publicly, everyone compared Dean to Brando because Brando was bigger, more famous, more marketable. Let's compare specific performances to see the real differences between Brando and Dean. Brando in A Streetcar Named Desire, 1951. Watch the scene where Stanley confronts Blanche. Brando is physically intimidating, sexually aggressive, deliberately frightening. He controls the space, dominates other actors, uses his body as a weapon. When he screams, "Stella!" it's a roar of ownership and desire. Brando's Stanley knows his power and uses it. Dean in East of Eden, 1955. Watch the birthday scene. Dean makes himself physically small, shoulders hunched, arms wrapped around himself protectively. He's trying to disappear while simultaneously begging to be seen. When he cries, it's not rage, it's collapse. Dean's Cal has no power and knows it. Brando in On the Waterfront, 1954. The famous "I could have been a contender" scene. Brando's Terry Malloy is regretful, but still has fight in him. The pain is real, but it's contained, channeled, controlled. Brando plays it quietly, almost tenderly, showing a man who's been broken, but isn't destroyed. Dean in Rebel Without a Cause, 1955. The scene where Jim begs his father to stand up to his mother. Dean is screaming, physically grabbing his father, desperately trying to force him to be strong. There's no control, no containment, just raw need exploding. Dean's Jim Stark isn't just broken. He's shattering in real time. The difference is clear in every frame. Brando plays men who have power but are trapped by circumstances. Dean plays boys who have no power and are desperate for it. Brando is a lion in a cage. Dean is a child in the dark, calling for someone to save him. September 30th, 1955. James Dean died in a car crash at age 24. He'd made exactly 3 films. His career lasted less than 2 years. He never got the chance to grow, evolve, challenge the Brando comparisons, or develop into his own mature artist. His death froze him in time as the eternal rebel, the forever young wounded boy. He would never age, never compromise, never become establishment. He would always be 24, beautiful, broken, and compared to Marlon Brando. Brando, meanwhile, lived another 59 years. He made over 40 more films. He won another Oscar. He got fat, difficult, weird. He became a recluse. He had affairs, scandals, family tragedies. He evolved, changed, became something completely different from the young rebel of Streetcar. The rivalry, if it ever existed, ended the moment Dean died. You can't compete with a ghost. You can't surpass a legend who never got the chance to fail. Brando's career, after 1955, was always shadowed by the question, would Dean have been better? Every time Brando gave a performance critics found disappointing, they'd wonder, if Dean had lived, would he have made different choices? Every time Brando turned down a great role, people speculated. Dean would have taken it. It was impossible and unfair. Brando was being compared not to the real James Dean, who probably would have aged, compromised, and made bad movies like every other actor. He was being compared to the fantasy Dean, the perfect rebel who died before he could disappoint anyone. In the 1970s, when Brando had become a reclusive legend and Dean had been dead for 15 years, an interviewer finally got Brando to talk seriously about the comparison. People wanted us to be rivals, Brando said. It sold newspapers, sold tickets. But I never felt competitive with Jimmy. How could I? He was a kid, talented, but still finding his way. I was already established. There was no rivalry except in people's heads. The interviewer pushed. But didn't it bother you to be constantly compared to a younger actor? Brando shrugged. I felt bad for him, honestly. He was so desperate to be seen as his own artist, and the comparisons made that impossible. I understood that desperation. I'd felt it too when I was young, but I survived it. He didn't. Then Brando said something surprising. In some ways, Jimmy had more courage than I did. I always kept something back, protected myself. He gave everything. That's why his performances feel so raw. He really was bleeding on camera. I was always acting, even when it looked spontaneous. He was actually dying up there. It was the most generous thing Brando ever said about Dean. And it came 20 years too late for Dean to hear it. So who won the rivalry that never really existed? The answer depends on what you're measuring. If you're measuring career longevity, Brando. He lived to be 80, made over 50 films, won 2 Oscars, became one of the most respected actors in history. If you're measuring cultural impact, Dean. Despite making only 3 films, Dean became the defining image of youthful rebellion for every generation after him. His face on posters, his style, his attitude, it all outlasted Brando's influence. If you're measuring pure performance, it's a tie. Brando's best work, Streetcar, Waterfront, Godfather, equals Dean's best work, Eden, Rebel, Giant. They were both masters of emotionally honest performance. If you're measuring personal cost, Dean paid more. Brando used his pain and survived. Dean used his pain and it killed him. Maybe not directly, but the recklessness, the need for danger, the inability to find peace, all stemmed from the wounds he kept reopening for his art. The truth is, there was no competition. They were complementary artists, not opposing forces. Brando showed that masculine vulnerability could be powerful. Dean showed that masculine vulnerability could be beautiful. Together, they changed what male actors were allowed to express on screen. Not every critic missed the difference between Brando and Dean. A few understood what they were watching. Kate Cameron of the New York Daily News wrote in her review of East of Eden, "Dean sounds at times like Marlon Brando, but he's a fine actor who plays his first film role with a naturalness that is completely convincing. This is not imitation. It's shared vocabulary used to express different things." Pauline Kael, writing years later, called Dean's work the enshrinement of the mixed-up kid, and recognized that Dean wasn't copying Brando, but channeling something more desperate and self-destructive. Kenneth Turan of the Los Angeles Times, writing 50 years after East of Eden, finally articulated the crucial difference. Dean didn't have Brando's power or control. What he had was vulnerability so extreme, it was almost unwatchable. That's not lesser acting. It's a different kind of greatness. These critics understood. Brando and Dean weren't the same actor at different ages. They were different artists using similar tools to express fundamentally different visions of wounded masculinity. Today, actors no longer have to choose between being like Brando or like Dean. The rivalry has become historical curiosity rather than active debate. Both actors are recognized as revolutionary, both as flawed, both as essential to understanding American acting. Modern actors cite both as influences without seeing contradiction. Leonardo DiCaprio credits East of Eden with making him want to act, but he studies Brando's technique. Christian Bale admires Dean's vulnerability, but emulates Brando's physicality. Phoenix, Gosling, Chalamet. They all draw on both legacies freely. The method acting they pioneered has evolved. Actors are taught to use personal experience, but also to protect themselves, to maintain boundaries, to go home and be themselves. The warning is always, don't be like Dean. Don't destroy yourself for authenticity. Brando's career showed the sustainable path. Use your pain, but control it. Dean's death showed the danger. If you can't separate yourself from the role will consume you. The Brando versus Dean rivalry was a construction. Two actors who barely knew each other were turned into opposing forces by critics, studios, and audiences who needed to understand revolutionary art through competition and comparison. The real story is sadder and more interesting. James Dean worshipped Marlon Brando, studied him obsessively, built his early career on tools Brando had pioneered. Dean spent his entire short career trying to escape Brando's shadow, while critics refused to let him. Brando, for his part, was mostly indifferent. Dean was talented, sure, but Brando was already established, already moving on to the next phase of his career. He didn't see Dean as a rival because there was no competition. They operated in different weight classes. Dean's death at 24 ended any possibility of actual rivalry. It froze him as the eternal young rebel, while Brando aged, changed, and became something entirely different. They became symbols. Brando, the actor who survived and evolved, Dean, the artist who burned too bright and died young. There was no winner. There was barely a rivalry. There were just two brilliant, damaged men using their pain to create art that changed cinema forever. That they're still being compared 70 years later says less about their similarities than about our need to understand genius through competition. The truth? Brando and Dean weren't rivals. They were both casualties of the same war. The battle to bring authentic emotion to the screen in an industry built on beautiful lies. Brando survived. Dean didn't. But both paid the price for their revolution. And both gave us something that still matters. Permission to be vulnerable wounded and broken, and to call that strength instead of weakness. That's not a rivalry. That's a legacy. This is the channel where we tell the untold stories of James Dean. The love he lost, the life he lived, the legend he became. If you enjoyed this story, please hit the like button and subscribe. There are more hidden truths waiting to be uncovered, and you won't want to miss them.